I wasn't supposed to be there that night. I mean, if I had any sense, I'd have stayed back at the cozy little inn we'd rented for our trip. But when my best friend Liam burst into my room, holding a crumpled map and wearing the kind of grin that meant trouble, I should have known better. "You won't believe this," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "There's an ancient ruin just 5 miles from here. It's not on any tourist map. Local legend says it's cursed." I rolled my eyes. Liam always had a knack for digging up the weirdest things, and his obsession with hidden treasures had gotten us into plenty of bizarre situations before. But I'll admit, there was something magnetic about the way he described the place. A ruined temple in the middle of nowhere, its origins shrouded in mystery, rumored to be abandoned for centuries. Midnight. That's when the locals say it comes alive, Liam added, almost whispering. "Comes alive?" I asked, folding my arms. "You know, spirits, shadows, that sort of thing. They call it the Shrine of Echoes. If you're quiet enough, they say you can hear voices, like whispers from the past." I wanted to laugh it off, but something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing to go. By 11:30 p.m., our little group was assembled: Liam, me, and 2 others, Kara, our history buff, and Nate, who always insisted he wasn't scared of anything, though his nervous fidgeting said otherwise. Armed with flashlights, a camera, and Liam's battered map, we set off into the cold, moonlit night. The path to the ruins was barely a trail, more like a series of faintly trodden patches of dirt that wound through a dense forest. The trees seemed to lean in as we walked, their gnarled branches stretching toward us like skeletal hands. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional rustle of something unseen in the underbrush. Kara broke the silence. "Did you know that ruins like this were often built on burial grounds? They say the energy of the dead lingers there." "Thanks for that comforting thought," Nate muttered. As we approached the site, the air grew colder, and an eerie stillness settled over the forest. The ruins came into view, crumbling stone pillars and walls, partially overtaken by vines and moss. In the moonlight, it looked both majestic and ominous, as if it had been waiting for us. "Look at that," Liam said, pointing to an inscription carved into one of the pillars. The writing was ancient, the symbols unfamiliar and unsettling. Kara snapped a photo and leaned in closer. "It's not any language I recognize," she murmured. "But it feels like it's watching us." I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. There was a presence here, something heavy in the air, like the ruins themselves were alive, breathing, observing. As we stepped further inside, Liam called out, "Guys, check this out." He held up a small rusted object he'd found on the ground. It looked like a pendant, shaped like an eye. "Put that down," Kara said sharply. "You don't know what it is." "Relax," Liam replied, slipping it into his pocket. "It's just a trinket." That's when we heard it. A low, almost imperceptible hum, like the vibration of a distant drum. It seemed to come from the ground beneath us, growing louder with each passing second. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nate nodded, his bravado gone. "What the hell is that?" The sound stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Then, from somewhere deep within the ruins, a faint whisper reached my ears. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like the suggestion of words. A melody of voices just out of reach. Kara clutched my arm. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. But Liam was already moving deeper into the ruins, drawn towards something we couldn't see. "Come on, this is incredible," he called out. I wanted to shout at him to stop, to turn back. But before I could, my flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment I saw something. A shadow that didn't belong to any of us, standing at the edge of the ruins, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. But the whispering? That stayed. Liam's voice echoed through the ruins as he called out, his excitement barely masking the unease growing between the rest of us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding on something ancient and angry. The faint whispers we'd heard earlier seemed to follow us now, weaving through the air like threads of an unseen web. "Liam, wait!" Kara shouted, her voice tight with panic. She clutched her flashlight tightly, its beam trembling as much as her hands. But Liam didn't stop. He was already halfway to what looked like the remains of an altar in the center of the ruins. The pendant he'd found earlier glinted faintly in the moonlight, swaying slightly as he moved. "This place, it's incredible," he murmured, almost to himself. The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances. Nate broke the silence. "This doesn't feel right, man. Let's just take a few pictures and get out of here." I wanted to agree, but something about the ruins held me captive. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. The air had shifted, heavier, colder, almost suffocating. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my feet refused to move. As we followed Liam reluctantly, Kara pointed her flashlight toward the ground. "Wait," she said, her voice sharp. "Look at this." The beam illuminated a series of strange markings carved into the stone floor. They formed a circular pattern around the altar, intricate and unsettling. Symbols I couldn't recognize spiraled inward, growing more chaotic the closer they got to the center. These aren't just random carvings," Kara whispered, crouching down to examine them. "It's like a ritual site. And this," she paused, her voice faltering. "This symbol in the middle, it's a warning." "A warning for what?" Nate asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kara didn't answer. She didn't have to. The moment her fingers brushed one of the carvings, the whispers grew louder, sharper. They weren't just in the air anymore. They were in my head. Words I couldn't understand crashed against my mind like waves, each one heavier than the last. I stumbled back, clutching my ears. "Stop! Make it stop!" But no one could. The whispers grew into a cacophony, and with them came a sound I will never forget. A deep, guttural groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. The ground beneath us trembled, sending small rocks and debris tumbling from the ruined pillars. Liam froze near the altar, his flashlight flickering wildly. "Liam!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Get away from there!" But he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on something we couldn't see, his face pale and slack. Slowly, his hand reached into his pocket, pulling out the pendant. As soon as he held it up, the air around him seemed to ripple, like heat rising off asphalt. A shape began to form in the darkness, tall, twisting, and impossibly wrong. It was a shadow, but it wasn't cast by anything. It moved with purpose, its edges flickering like flames. "Do you see that?" Nate asked, his voice shaking. "Of course. We see it," Kara snapped, grabbing his arm. "We need to go, now." But Liam was transfixed. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice distant and hollow. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran toward him, grabbing his arm and shaking him. "Liam, snap out of it," His eyes darted to mine, wide and filled with something I couldn't place. Fear, awe, or maybe both. I think, I think it's trying to tell me something. Tell you what? I demanded, my grip tightening. Before he could answer, the shadow lunged. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, wrapping itself around Liam like a living mist. He screamed, a sound so raw and guttural it made my blood run cold. Help him, Kara yelled, but none of us knew what to do. I grabbed at Liam's arm, trying to pull him away, but it was like he was glued to the spot. The shadow burned cold, searing my skin where it touched me. Liam's screams faded into a strangled gasp, and then he went silent. The shadow released him, retreating back toward the altar as quickly as it had come. Liam collapsed to the ground, his body limp and lifeless. Liam! I shouted, shaking him. He wasn't dead. His chest still rose and fell, but his eyes stared blankly at the sky, unseeing. We have to get him out of here, Kara said, her voice trembling. Nate nodded, his bravado completely gone. Yeah, before whatever that thing is comes back. But as we lifted Liam, the whispers started again, louder, angrier. And this time, they weren't just whispers. They were voices, clear and cruel, speaking in a language that felt older than the ruins themselves. One word stood out, repeated over and over. Leave. We didn't need to be told twice. We were running out of time. As we hoisted Liam's limp body between us, the weight of fear pressed down harder than the cold night air. The ruins seemed to close in around us. The once silent, eerie whispers now growing into a chorus of rage. The voices weren't just sounds anymore. They were in our heads screaming, demanding, Leave! Leave now! The shadows danced erratically along the crumbling walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for us. My breath hitched in my chest as I felt the temperature plummet even further, the cold slicing through my skin like shards of ice. It was as if the ruins themselves were alive, fighting to keep us trapped. Kara was the first to speak, her voice shaky but determined. We have to move faster. Whatever's here, it doesn't want us leaving alive. Nate, on the other hand, was barely holding it together. What the hell was that thing? Shadows don't move like that. They don't attack. This isn't real, man. This can't be real. It's real, I snapped, trying to steady him as we stumbled through the uneven ground. And if we don't keep moving, we're not going to make it out of here. Liam groaned weakly, his head lolling to the side. His eyes were still open, but unfocused, his lips moving silently, as though he was speaking to someone, or something we couldn't see. Liam, I shook him lightly, panic rising in my chest. Stay with us, man. Come on, wake up. His voice was barely a whisper, but I caught it. It sees everything. What does? I demanded, my grip tightening on his arm. What sees everything? But before he could answer, the ground beneath us trembled again. This time, it wasn't a faint vibration. It was a violent quake that nearly knocked us off our feet. Stones from the ruins began to fall, crashing down with thunderous booms that echoed through the night. We're going to get crushed, Kara screamed, shielding her head as a large chunk of debris slammed into the ground just inches from where she stood. Run, I shouted, adrenaline surging through me. Just run. But running wasn't as easy as it sounded. The forest we'd passed through earlier, which had seemed unsettling but manageable, now felt like a labyrinth. The path we'd taken to get her had vanished, swallowed by the darkness and the encroaching shadows. Every direction looked the same, trees twisting unnaturally, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal arms. The whispers grew louder, more coherent. They weren't just voices anymore. They were accusations, thieves, liars, intruders. I looked back over my shoulder and instantly regretted it. The shadowy figure from earlier had returned, but now it wasn't alone. Dozens of smaller shadows emerged from the cracks in the stone, slithering and writhing like living darkness. Their shapes were distorted, vaguely humanoid but wrong in every way. "They're following us!" Nate shouted, his voice cracking. "Oh God, they're following us!" "Don't look back!" I yelled, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Just keep moving!" But the shadows were faster. No matter how quickly we ran, they seemed to close the distance effortlessly, gliding over the ground like smoke. "Over here!" Kara suddenly shouted, pointing to a narrow gap between two towering stone pillars. "It's a way out." I didn't question her. We veered toward the gap, Liam's weight dragging heavily between Nate and me as we pushed forward. The shadows hissed behind us, their voices merging into a deafening roar. As we squeezed through the gap, the air grew colder, and a sharp metallic smell filled my nostrils. I glanced down and realized the ground was no longer dirt. It was stone, slick and dark, like it had been drenched in something wet. "This isn't right," I muttered, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. "This doesn't feel like the way we came." "It's the only way," Kara snapped, her voice trembling but resolute. The shadows didn't seem to care where we were headed. They pressed closer, their shapes becoming more defined. Elongated limbs, hollow eyes that glowed faintly, and mouths that stretched far too wide. One of them lunged. I barely had time to react. The thing's claw-like appendage swiped at my arm, leaving a searing cold that burned worse than fire. I cried out, nearly dropping Liam. "They're catching up!" Nate yelled, his panic spilling over into sobs. "Move!" I shouted through gritted teeth, forcing myself to ignore the pain. Finally, we stumbled into a clearing, a circular space surrounded by jagged stone monoliths. The moon hung high above us, its light strangely dim, as though even it didn't dare shine too brightly here. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone well, its edges covered in the same strange carvings we'd seen earlier. The whispers grew deafening as we approached it, the air vibrating with their intensity. "What now?" Kara asked, her voice desperate. "Where do we go?" Before I could answer, Liam stirred again. His eyes rolled back, and his voice came out in a guttural rasp that wasn't his own. "You will not leave." The shadows erupted into the clearing, circling us like predators. We were surrounded, their hollow eyes locking onto us with an intensity that froze me in place. "We're trapped," Nate whispered, his voice barely audible. "No," I said, shaking my head. "There's got to be a way out. There has to be." But deep down I wasn't sure anymore. The shadows pressed closer, their forms shifting and twisting, their whispers turning into screams. And then, as if in answer to my unspoken question, the ground beneath the well began to glow, a faint, sickly green light that pulsed in time with the shadows' movements. "It's the pendant," Kara said suddenly, her eyes wide. "Liam still has it. They're drawn to it." I didn't have time to think. Reaching into Liam's pocket, I pulled out the cursed pendant, its cold surface biting into my palm. The moment it left his body, the shadows recoiled slightly, their hissing voices rising in anger. "What do we do with it?" Nate shouted. "Throw it in the well," Kara screamed. Without hesitation, I hurled the pendant into the glowing abyss. The moment it disappeared, the ground shook violently, and a blinding light erupted from the well. The shadows shrieked, their forms unraveling like smoke in the wind. The air grew still, the whispers silenced. For a moment, all was quiet. Then Liam gasped, his body jerking as if waking from a nightmare. His eyes focused on mine, wide with terror. "Did we make it?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer. The ruins were silent now, but the oppressive feeling lingered. Whatever we disturbed had let us go, for now. But as we stumbled away from the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, waiting for its next visitors. We thought it was over. As we staggered out of the ruins, the oppressive darkness gave way to the faint glow of the moon. The forest, though still eerily silent, no longer felt alive with malicious intent. For the first time that night, I felt like I could breathe again. Liam was conscious, though pale and trembling, and Kara and Nate looked like they had aged years in just a few hours. "We're safe now," Kara whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's over?" But deep down I wasn't so sure. The path back to the car was clearer now, as if the forest itself had shifted to guide us out. No twisted branches clawed at our skin. No unseen forces tugged at our clothes. It was almost too easy, like the ruins were letting us go, but not without a price. Liam was the first to speak. As we reached the edge of the clearing, his voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I saw it, in the light. When you threw the pendant, it wasn't destroyed. It just moved." "Moved where?" Nate asked, his voice breaking. "What do you mean?" Liam shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, but it's not gone. It's still here. Somewhere." His words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to dismiss them as the ramblings of someone still shaken by the night's events, but the look in his eyes told me otherwise. He had seen something we couldn't comprehend. As we reached the car, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest felt different now, almost as if it were observing us, deciding what to do next. Kara fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling as she unlocked the doors. "Let's just get out of here," she muttered, her voice tight with exhaustion. We piled into the car, the engine roaring to life as Kara floored the gas pedal. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, and the ruins disappeared into the darkness behind us. For the first time all night, I felt a sliver of relief, until Liam spoke again. "I don't think it'll let us go." We all turned to look at him, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His hands clutched at the seatbelt like a lifeline, his eyes darting around as if he could see something the rest of us couldn't. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Liam didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small and cold. My stomach dropped. It was the pendant. "No," Kara whispered, slamming the brakes so hard we lurched forward in our seats. "That's not possible. You threw it into the well. I saw you." "I did," I said, my voice barely audible. "I swear I did." But there it was, the cursed object lying in Liam's trembling hand. The carvings glowed faintly, as if mocking us. "We didn't escape," Liam said, his voice breaking. "We just brought it with us." Silence filled the car as the realization sank in. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had just grown quieter, waiting for the right moment to return. And then, faint but unmistakable, I heard it again. "You cannot leave." The voice echoed in my mind, cold and unrelenting. The shadows weren't confined to the ruins. They were with us now, attached to the cursed pendant we had unwittingly carried out. I looked out the window, my heart sinking as I noticed the trees lining the road. They were no longer the same ones we had passed earlier. These trees were gnarled, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes that seemed to reach for the car. "We're not out," Nate whispered, his voice trembling. "We're still in it." Kari slammed on the accelerator, the car hurtling down the winding road. But the forest didn't end. It stretched on endlessly, the same twisted trees repeating like a nightmarish loop. The pendant glowed brighter, and Liam let out a scream, clutching his head as if something were clawing at his mind. "Make it stop," he cried. "Please, make it stop." But there was nothing we could do. As the car sped through the endless forest, I realized the truth. We had opened a door that couldn't be closed, awakened something that couldn't be silenced. The ruins weren't just a place. They were a gateway, and we had crossed a threshold we could never return from. The whispers grew louder, enveloping us completely. The last thing I saw before the world went dark was the pendant, glowing with an otherworldly light, as if it were alive. And then silence.